Welcome to the deep dive. It feels like the term spirit animal is just everywhere these days, doesn't it?
It really does.
You see it from people feeling a really deep personal connection all the way to those funny internet memes, pizza is my spirit
And
animals.
the whole spectrum.
It's become so common. But what our sources are showing is that there's this incredibly deep history and, well, complexity behind the idea. It goes way beyond how we often use it today, sometimes pretty lightly.
Yeah, there's a lot more to it.
It's often profoundly misunderstood, actually. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit.
What's fascinating here, I think, is how that modern, often really simplified usage. It's like a tiny, tiny window onto these huge, incredibly intricate global belief systems.
It's just a glimpse.
Exactly, because for so many traditional worldviews, and especially for indigenous peoples, these aren't just, whimsical likes or dislikes. They're fundamental, foundational elements of kinship, how the universe works, social structure.
Wow.
They're woven right into the fabric of reality as they understand it.
Absolutely. So our mission, really, for this deep dive is to explore that journey. How did this concept of a spiritual connection with animals evolve from these ancient community-rooted traditions to the kind of modern interpretations we see all around us now?
That evolution is key.
And just as crucially, we need to shed some light on the really important debates happening right now about cultural appropriation.
Vital discussions.
We've distilled some really insightful points from our sources, hoping to help you get truly well-informed on this whole fascinating topic.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this idea animal guides, we kind of need to understand the ground these beliefs grow from first.
Right, the philosophical soil, so to speak.
Yeah. The modern Western way of thinking often asks, do you believe animals have spirits? But that question itself, it already assumes this split, this separation between a physical world out there and a person in here who might believe something about it.
Ah, I see that.
And that whole framework, it turns out, is pretty alien to the worldviews where the idea of animal spirits actually originates.
So it's not about believing in it, but something else.
That's a crucial point. For these traditions, it's less a question of belief and more about ontology, like the actual nature of being, of reality itself.
Okay.
The world isn't seen as just a collection of objects you might choose to believe in or not. It's understood as a community of persons, beings you relate to.
A community,
Yeah,
including non-humans.
precisely. And it's within that relational understanding, that ontology, seeing the world as a community of active persons you relate with, that the whole concept of an animal guide becomes, well, not just possible, but logical, even necessary sometimes.
That's a huge shift in perspective. It makes the world feel so much more alive, interactive.
It does.
So let's maybe start with animism. A lot of us probably have maybe a simplified, maybe even kind of primitive idea of what that word means. What have our sources taught us about the real contemporary understanding of animism?
Yeah, the old ideas are often quite off. Contemporary scholarship gives us a much more sophisticated picture. It's better described as a relational ontology.
Okay, that term again.
Right. It's a worldview where the world is seen as this vast community of living persons, and this is key. Only some of them are human.
Right.
This view doesn't really draw a sharp line between a spiritual world and a physical one. Instead, it sees everything: animals, plants, rocks, rivers, even things people make as having animation, a distinct spiritual essence, agency, personhood.
Personhood for a rock.
Potentially, yes.
Hmm.
For instance, one powerful example from the sources describes a powwow held by the Kane River Micmac. An eagle circled overhead. Now, they didn't just admire it like, oh, pretty bird. No, it was greeted as a relative. Its presence was interpreted as approval for the community returning to traditional spiritual ways.
Wow, that's direct communication.
It really highlights a relationship built on reciprocity and respect. Rituals aren't just symbolic. They're performed to maintain social relationships with these other-than-human persons.
It really reframes everything, makes the world feel like an active participant. Our sources mention other examples too, don't they? Like the Sami people in Northern Europe.
Yes, their relationship with reindeer. It's seen as mutual caretaking. The reindeer give themselves to humans, and humans in return provide shelter, care.
And it goes beyond animals, you said.
Absolutely. The Maori of New Zealand, for example, offer invocations to sweet potatoes when they harvest them, acknowledging a shared kinship.
Even plants.
Even stones. For the Ojibwe, a stone struck by lightning can become a thunderer, a powerful storm person.
So attributing personhood is central.
It's absolutely key. It shows a holistic, non-hierarchical way of seeing the cosmos. And It's important to distinguish animism from totemism, though they often overlap a bit.
How so?
Well, animism tends to focus on lots of individual spirit beings helping life go on. Totemism more typically points to a primary source, maybe the land itself, or a single ancestor that becomes the emblem for a whole social group, like a clan.
Got it. Different focus.
But the fundamental idea in animism is that humans are part of nature, not separate from it, not above it. And that creates this world that's alive with sentient beings you have to carefully navigate relationships with.
Okay, so animism gives us the worldview, this deep sense the world is alive and it's all about relationships. But if the world is truly alive like that, how do people traditionally, interact with it? What are the ways to engage with this relational ontology?
That's where something like shamanism often comes in. The term shamanism itself is, well, it's complicated.
How do you mean?
It originates from the Tungus language, the Evenki people in Siberia,
Yeah.
from the word shaman, which referred specifically to a male practitioner.
Oh.
Unfortunately, early Western anthropologists kind of grabbed that term and generalized it, and they often ignored the female Tungus practitioners, the Udigan, who were equally respected.
So the term itself has issues.
It does. Many indigenous cultures don't actually use or identify with the word shamanism at all. They have their own specific terms. And even in modern circles, calling yourself a shaman is tricky. Many feel it's a title given by the spirits and the community, not something you just claim.
So they might use a different term.
Yeah, many contemporary practitioners prefer something like shamanic practitioner.
Right. That's a really important clarification. Okay, so despite those complexities with the word, the core practice of shamanism is usually understood as a path of direct revelation.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about entering an altered state of consciousness, maybe through drumming, chanting, dancing, sometimes using psychoactive plants.
Right.
To journey into what's often called non-ordinary reality. And the purpose of these journeys, as the sources explain, is usually to communicate with spirits for knowledge, for healing, or other really vital services for the community.
And animals play a role here.
A central role.
Yeah.
The relationship with helping spirits is fundamental, and very often these are animal spirits.
Often called power animals now.
Yes, particularly by modern practitioners. But in traditional shamanic contexts, these animal spirits aren't picked by the person. It's the other way around. The spirit chooses the person it will help.
Ah, the spirit chooses.
Right. And this animal ally offers its unique medicine. It's sort of archetypal energy, its wisdom, its power that the shaman can then call upon. The connection is so deep that shamans might even shapeshift into their power animal's form during a journey.
Like the Sami traditions.
Exactly, like the Sami Noetit, they're ritual specialists who got help from what they called Saiva animals.
It's worth pausing for a second on why. Why did shamanism, with these intense rituals, resonate so deeply and stick around across so many different cultures for so long? Scholars have some interesting ideas, right?
They do. One idea, sometimes called a neurotheological theory, suggests these trance states might have actually offered real-world advantages.
How so?
Well, by integrating different brain functions, maybe a shaman's ability to, say, predict animal movements or resolve community conflicts actually improved. So it provided a valuable social service.
Makes sense. Survival advantage.
Another perspective, the byproduct model, argues shamanism acts like a kind of cultural technology. It essentially hacks our built-in psychological bias.
That's their biases.
Think about it. Humans really want to influence things they can't control, like illness or the weather. Shamanism, with its dramatic rituals, creates this compelling, maybe illusion of control. It convinces people the practitioner can interact with these invisible forces.
Interesting. So providing a sense of agency.
Perhaps. But whatever the theory, the evidence for shamanic practices is incredibly old. It predates all organized religions. Some of the earliest hints go back to the Upper Paleolithic.
Wow, ancient.
So we're not just talking about beliefs, but maybe about deeply wired human needs or even how our brains function. It's a different way to look at it, definitely.
Yeah, it is. And it's clear just from this part of the conversation that the words we use, the terminology, it's a real point of confusion, isn't it? Mostly from oversimplification, it seems.
Absolutely.
Spirit animal, power animal, totem animal, people tend to just throw them around like they all mean the same thing.
Right, but they come from really distinct conceptual backgrounds and describe different kinds of relationships.
Okay, can you break that down a bit?
Sure. A totem animal that typically refers to something inherited. It's a lifelong ancestral or clan symbol that defines a group's identity, their social structure. It's about group kinship.
Okay, group identity. Got it.
Then power animal That's a term really popularized by modern shamanic practitioners. It usually refers to a specific spirit ally that someone deliberately seeks out, often in altered states, for empowerment and help in shamanic work.
More individual, more sought after.
Yes, and spirit animal itself, while it's likely not even originally an indigenous term, probably something early anthropologists came up with to try and explain complex beliefs to a Western audience.
Ah, an outsider's label.
Probably. And in its modern use, it often means something more ephemeral, like a guide that pops up at key moments to teach a specific lesson. Conflating all these terms just strips them of their cultural specificity.
Okay, that distinction is crucial. So with those foundational ideas clear, let's maybe take a quick trip around the world, culturally speaking, to see just how diverse these human-animal-spiritual relationships actually are.
Good idea.
Because, I mean, just talking about one Native American belief is already a huge oversimplification, right? There are hundreds of distinct nations.
Absolutely profound oversimplification. But if there's a common thread among many Indigenous American worldviews, it's often this concept of kinship with the animal world.
Kinship relatives.
Exactly. The popular non-native idea of a spirit animal is often seen as trivializing relationships that have been cultivated for literally tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
Animals aren't just symbols. They're relatives, they're members of other nations, partners in a sacred agreement with humans and the land.
That's fundamentally different from just feeling an affinity for something.
Worlds apart.
And this idea of kinship, it gets formally expressed in things like clan systems.
Yes, very clearly. Among the Haudenosaunee, who you might know as the Iroquois, society is organized into matrilineal clans,
Right.
Turtle Clan, Bear Clan, Wolf Clan, and others.
Matrilineal, so it's through the mother's line.
Right. You're born into your mother's clan, and that animal represents your extended family, your lineage. It's not about picking something you like. It's fundamental to who you are and what your social responsibilities are.
Like the Turtle Clan you mentioned.
Yeah, the Turtle Clan people were traditionally seen as keepers of the land, which connects back to their creation story.
So it links identity, responsibility, and cosmology.
Precisely. And beyond that group identity, many traditions also recognize personal guardian spirits. Some talk about maybe 9 different guides appearing throughout life, but with one main totem animal staying as a lifelong guardian.
How does someone connect with that?
Often through dreams, or maybe recognizing shared characteristics. And the meaning of specific animals varies hugely, too. The wolf, for example, is a noble creator spirit for the Shoshone, a brother figure for the Anishinaabe, a guardian of direction for some Pueblo peoples.
So not one single meaning for wolf.
Not at all. Same with the bear, revered as a powerful healer called the elder kinsman in Haida culture. And you see this reverence reflected in their sacred art.
Like pottery or carvings.
Exactly. The images on pottery or kachina dolls, for instance, they aren't just decoration. They're ways of honoring these connections, telling specific family and clan histories. It's not just symbolic art. It's like a living record of their most important relationships.
Okay, let's move across the Atlantic now. Ancient Celts. Their spiritual world sounds like it was also deeply animistic.
Fundamentally animistic, yes. Every animal, river, mountain, tree grove, all seen as spirited. And a really central theme in Celtic mythology is fluidity,
Damn.
transformation.
Shape-shifting.
Lots of shape-shifting. The boundaries between human, animal, even deities seem to have been quite permeable.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The Morrigan, a complex goddess figure tied to war and fate, she was a master shapeshifter. Could appear as a raven, a crow, an eel, a wolf, a cow.
Versatile.
Very. Other stories involve transformations because of spells or curses, like the famous legend of the children of Lear turned into swans for centuries.
Oh, I know that one. Sad story.
It is. Even hero spouses might have animal origins, like Fionn McGumhale's wife, Saba, who was originally a deer transformed into a woman.
So this constant shifting, it's more than just a cool story element.
I think so. It's a powerful insight into a worldview where identity wasn't rigidly fixed by species, that radically challenges our modern, often very fixed categories of what it means to be.
In that kind of fluid world, animals often seem to act as messengers or guides between worlds, right?
Yes, mediators between the mortal world and the other world, Tir na Nog. Often, the appearance of a supernatural animal, frequently a white stag or a white doe, was the narrative trigger that lured a hero into a mystical adventure. The hunt itself could be a doorway to the supernatural.
And certain animals had strong symbolic meanings.
Definitely. The boar was often linked to royalty and warrior strength. The salmon of wisdom, famously caught by Fionn, represented profound knowledge.
What about snakes or birds?
The snake, or nether, was associated with the Druids, symbolizing wisdom, healing, rebirth. Ravens and crows were deeply connected to prophecy, battle, and deities like the Morrigan. These aren't just charming folk tales. They show a deep spiritual connection where animals were crucial for navigating life and understanding hidden truths.
Okay, from the Greenlands of the Celts, let's journey now to uh, the vast, often harsh landscapes of Siberia. Shamanism is really core there, isn't it?
Absolutely central to many indigenous spiritual practices there, and the bond with animal spirits is unbreakable.
How so?
Well, for a Siberian shaman, having helping spirits, and most of them are animal forms, it's the absolute essential requirement for their work. These spirits think bear, elk, wolf, seal. They provide information, power, practical help for those ecstatic journeys into the spirit world.
Is there one animal that's particularly important?
The reindeer holds a really prominent place, which makes sense given its central role in the life of the region's nomadic peoples. It's more than just food and transport. It's a primary spiritual vehicle.
So it connects survival and spirituality directly.
Intimately tied.
That's fascinating. So the shaman's drum, which is often their most vital tool.
It's often conceived of as their reindeer, the mount that carries them on their spirit journeys.
Yeah.
The act of drumming itself is sometimes described as driving the reindeer.
Wow.
And you see this connection in their ritual clothing, too often made from reindeer hide, maybe adorned with antlers. The belief is that this transfers the reindeer's qualities, its speed, endurance, alertness, directly to the shaman.
So the rituals themselves embody this.
Yes, shamanic rituals there are deeply performative, often centered on animal transformation. Shamans will imitate the movements, the sounds, the behaviors of animals and birds to connect with their specific power.
And this continues today.
Yes, contemporary Siberian rituals still focus on this, invoking the bear's power for protection, the snake for healing, the wolf for creativity, the crow for magic. It's all embedded in that broader animistic worldview, emphasizing balanced respect between humans and nature, showing respect to the spirit owners of mountains and lakes through offerings, for example.
Okay. Let's shift our focus again now to the incredibly diverse spiritual landscapes of Asia. Animals play huge roles there too, but often in different ways, right?
Equally significant, yes, but often structured differently. Take Hinduism, for example. There isn't really a direct equivalent to that individualized spirit animal idea we've been talking about.
No, but animals are important.
Deeply revered. A key concept is the vahana. This is the divine mount or vehicle associated with a specific deity.
Like a god's chosen ride.
Kind of, but much more than just transportation. They're seen as extensions of the god's own power and symbolize their specific attributes. Think of Nandi, the bull who carries Lord Shiva. Nandi represents strength, steadfastness.
Okay. Any others?
Garuda, the mighty eagle who carries Lord Vishnu, symbolizes speed, power, victory over evil. And animals even appear as avatars, incarnations of the gods themselves. Lord Vishnu famously incarnated as Matsya the fish, Kurma the tortoise, Vairava the boar.
So the divine and animal are really intertwined.
Intimately, yes.
Now, moving to Chinese cosmology, it seems much more ordered, symbolic.
Highly symbolic and ordered is a good way to put it. You have the four celestial animals, the azure dragon, vermilion bird, white tiger, and black tortoise.
The guardians of the directions?
Exactly. They guard the cardinal directions, but also represent seasons, elements, virtues. It's a whole system.
And there are others too.
Yes. Alongside them are the four auspicious beasts, the dragon, the phoenix, the quillin, which is like a mythical unicorn deer, and the tortoise. They're revered symbols of good fortune, prosperity, long life.
The dragon seems especially important in China.
Paramount, really. Represents the emperor, divine power, strength, good luck. Even symbolically, the Chinese nationality itself.
Are there more folk traditions too?
Oh, yes. In some northern Chinese folk beliefs, certain animals, particularly the fox, weasel, hedgehog, and snake, are believed to have magical powers. They're called the four animal spirits sometimes, and thought capable of healing or prophecy. It's less about individual guides, though, and more about this cosmic balance and specific animal powers.
Okay. And then Japan. We often hear about animal spirits in Japanese folklore.
Definitely. The spiritual world there is full of yukai, a huge category of supernatural beings, and among them are the henge, which means shapeshifters.
Shapeshifters again?
Yes. The most famous are probably the kitsune, the fox spirits, and the tanuki, the raccoon dogs.
The kitsune, they're the tricky ones, right?
Often portrayed that way, yes. Intelligent, powerful, sometimes benevolent messengers for Inari, the god of rice, other times quite malicious. Their power is said to grow with age, culminating in the powerful nine-tailed fox.
And the tanuki.
Generally more comical, maybe a bit bumbling. A beloved figure associated with fun, generosity, good fortune. You often see statues of them outside restaurants, sometimes with prominent testicles symbolizing wealth.
Right, I've seen those. So across Asia, very different traditions, but a shared recognition of animals as sources of power, wisdom, symbolic meaning.
A deeply shared heritage, yes, even if the specific forms and relationships vary hugely.
Wow. Okay, this quick cross-cultural tour really highlights the spectrum, doesn't it, in how animal spirits are understood.
A clear spectrum, I think.
At one end, like you said, many Indigenous American traditions emphasize kinship. It's about shared identity, family, reciprocal duties.
Right. Relationship and responsibility.
Then Celtic traditions, with all the shape-shifting, seem to highlight fluidity. Boundaries aren't fixed.
Permeability is key there.
Hindu traditions, maybe through the Vahana system, present often a more maybe hierarchical relationship. Animals are powerful, but often as extensions of a primary god.
An associated power, yes.
And Chinese cosmology, with its guardians and systems, feels heavily oriented toward cosmological symbolism. Animals representing principles, forces, order.
Abstract principles mapped onto the animal world.
This whole spectrum, from kin to fluid being to divine vehicle to cosmic symbol, that nuance is so often lost in just the generic, popular idea of a spirit animal.
Completely lost. It's far more diverse and complex than one single universal concept.
It's also interesting how certain types of figures pop up across cultures, like trickster's coyote in Native American stories, the cunning fox in some Celtic and Japanese tales, maybe raven in others.
Yes, those figures are fascinating.
They seem to show up independently in very different places. Does that point to something?
I think it points to a shared function they serve. They embody ambiguity, they challenge rules and rigid structures, they teach vital lessons about adaptability, often through chaos and humor.
So they help us deal with the messy parts of life.
Exactly. Their independent emergence probably suggests they fulfill some universal human need in storytelling, a way to personify and navigate the unpredictable, the paradoxical parts of being human, making sense of the messiness.
Okay, so as these traditional, often animistic worldviews have perhaps receded in some ways under modernity, these concepts of animal spirits didn't just vanish.
Yeah, they didn't disappear.
Instead, it seems they got reinterpreted, absorbed into new frameworks, particularly Western psychology and sort of eclectic spirituality of the New Age movement.
Yes, a process of translation, you could say.
Right.
And this translation has really fundamentally changed the nature of that human-animal spiritual relationship.
So?
It's shifted the focus away from communal responsibility and external spirit beings towards individual psychology and internal archetypes. It's like a re-enchantment of old ideas, but for the modern individual psyche.
But that comes with pluses and minuses.
Definitely. Profound insights sometimes, but also some pretty problematic simplifications.
Let's look at the psychological angle first, maybe through Carl Jung. He offers a really powerful way to understand why animal symbols still resonate so strongly in our minds, right?
He does. Instead of seeing animal spirits as literal external beings, Jungian psychology views them as potent archetypes.
Archetypes, universal patterns.
Universal inherited patterns of thought and imagery that reside in what he called the collective unconscious of all humans.
Okay.
These archetypes are basically the psychic equivalent of our biological instincts. Ancient forms that get activated by our life experiences, our culture.
So from that perspective, when animals show up in dreams or visions?
They aren't external guides coming to visit. They're symbolic manifestations of deep psychic forces within us. Jung thought animals represent our instinctual side, the pre-rational, sometimes even the divine part of the human psyche, because we see them as living closer to their own inner nature, their own laws.
So connecting with those animal archetypes is a way to connect with ourselves.
Exactly. A pathway to reconnecting with our own instinctual nature, achieving psychological wholeness, or what he called individuation, exploring our own inner wildness, you might say.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. So certain animals take on specific symbolic meanings.
Yes. Animals that cross realms like snakes moving between earth and underworld, or birds between earth and sky, they often symbolize the self, Jung's term for the core organizing principle of the psyche.
And the snake shedding its skin.
A powerful symbol of psychic transformation, rebirth. Other animals stand for specific instincts. The horse might be physical vitality, the dog, loyalty or intuition, the cat, perhaps the instinctual feminine.
Does this framework account for the fact that animal symbols can be both positive and negative?
Absolutely. It acknowledges their dual nature. A wolf, for instance, could represent positive loyalty and community, but also the destructive side of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress.
Like our own predatory instincts.
Exactly. Or the fox and coyote embody the cleverness of the trickster archetype. That cleverness can be used for positive adaptation or for manipulation and deceit. This psychological lens offers a non-literal way to engage with spirit animals, seeing them as powerful mirrors for our inner world, catalysts for growth.
Okay, so alongside that psychological view, the second half of the 20th century saw this huge rise in New Age and neo-shamanic movements. And they've really run with the concept of animal guides, haven't they?
They absolutely have. Popularized it immensely, but also significantly changed it. They often blend concepts together, bits from Indigenous American traditions, maybe some Siberian ideas, Celtic lore, into a new kind of syncretic mix.
A spiritual pick and mix.
In some ways, yes. And in that process, culturally specific, often very complex ideas tend to get simplified, sometimes commodified even, for a largely Western audience looking for personal spiritual growth.
Right.
These movements promote all sorts of accessible methods for discovering your spirit or power animal. It gets framed as a skill you can learn, rather than, say, a sacred relationship that's bestowed upon you or inherited through lineage.
So things like guided meditations, analyzing your dreams.
Or just feeling a strong affinity for an animal you saw on TV, perhaps.
I'm pretty sure there are online quizzes now that tell you your spirit animal, right?
Oh, definitely. Quizzes, workshops, books, and critically, these modern takes often just mash together terms like spirit animal, power animal, totem animal, ignoring their distinct origins and meanings.
Creating a generic one-size-fits-all concept.
Exactly, something that fits easily into a kind of spiritual marketplace.
And maybe the biggest difference from traditional views is how individualistic it often is.
That's perhaps the most significant departure, yes. The focus is very much on the self, on self-help. Traditional relationships with animal spirits are usually embedded in community, responsibility, lineage, ecological balance.
But the modern goal
Is typically personal empowerment, personal healing, achieving your individual goals. The animal guide becomes your personal ally, whose medicine you can harness to overcome your personal challenges.
That's a fundamental shift in focus, isn't it? From community to self.
It is, and it also changes the nature of the spirit itself in a way.
How do you mean?
Well, in traditional animistic and shamanic views, the animal spirit is often seen as an autonomous, external being. It has its own agency. The spirit chooses the person, remember?
Right.
In the Jungian, the psychological model, the spirit is internal. It's an archetype within your own psyche.
Okay.
The New Age approach often sits in this kind of fuzzy middle ground. It might talk about an external guide, but one whose main purpose seems to be facilitating your internal development.
And this shift also changes how you connect, makes it more like a technique.
Yes, it transforms the connection from maybe a sacred practice, often involving ordeal or deep community ties, into something more like a spiritual technology.
Like a tool you can learn to use.
Exactly. You find step-by-step guides, those online quizzes, workshops on how to find your spirit animal. It's presented as readily available knowledge.
Which is very different from traditional contexts.
Vastly different. Where traditionally, such a connection might come from a dangerous vision quest, an initiation, an inherited right, or be a gift directly bestowed by the spirits, often involving specific knowledge and rituals considered sacred and kept secret within the community.
So the modern democratized approach, while making it accessible,
Simultaneously decontextualizes it, strips it of its sacredness, and crucially strips it of the system of responsibilities that traditionally went along with it.
Now, this huge popularization of spirit animals, especially in Western cultures, it hasn't happened without pushback,
Not at all. It's ignited some really intense debate and criticism.
particularly from indigenous scholars and communities, right? They see this modern usage very differently.
Very differently. From many indigenous perspectives, this isn't seen as harmless borrowing or a form of appreciation. It's often defined as a form of racism, actually, a tool of colonization.
That's strong language.
It is, but the argument is that when a dominant culture takes over the religious ceremonies, the sacred items, the core concepts of a people they have colonized, it's fundamentally different from cultural exchange between equals. It happens within a power imbalance against a backdrop of historical trauma, genocide, and ongoing oppression.
Okay. Our sources highlight several specific ways this causes harm. The first is trivialization.
Right. Taking relationships with the animal world, relationships built over millennia, forming the basis of law, kinship, cosmology, and reducing them to an internet meme or a personality quirk like, my spirit animal is coffee.
Or pizza.
Or pizza. The Smithsonian Institution has explicitly said that using the concept this way trivializes native relationships to the animal world. It's seen as deeply disrespectful.
Okay, disrespect is one layer. What else?
Second, this kind of appropriation contributes to the erasure of living indigenous peoples. By romanticizing native spirituality, often freezing it in some idealized, noblest savage past.
It makes it harder to see contemporary issues.
Exactly. It makes it harder for the dominant culture to see and engage with the real present-day struggles of indigenous communities. Things like fighting for land rights, dealing with poverty, environmental racism, the ongoing push for sovereignty and self-determination.
And third, it's viewed as just theft.
Outright theft, yes. There is a quote from Tulalip elder Janet McLeod describing it as the latest theft in a long line. First they came to take our land and water, then our fish and game. Now they want our religions as well.
That puts it starkly.
It does. And Tristan Picot, who is Lakota, explains that in his tradition, an animal spirit isn't something you just receive or claim whenever you feel like it. The spirit decides if it's necessary to help someone deemed worthy. So for an outsider to just claim one is seen as extremely arrogant. It shows a complete lack of understanding.
Wow. Arrogant.
And this critique goes even deeper with the concept of animal colonialism.
What's that?
It's a term from Dine feminist scholar Kelsey Dale John. She argues that colonial violence specifically targeted the sacred relationships between indigenous peoples and other-than-human animals. This was a strategy to attack indigenous life and sovereignty itself.
Can you give an example?
Her work discusses how the colonial state deliberately devalued Dine horses and disrupted their traditional matrilineal ways of caring for livestock. This wasn't just economic, it was a direct assault on Dine cosmology, aimed at forcing assimilation.
So from that viewpoint, taking indigenous ideas about animals isn't just spiritual exploration.
It's seen as a continuation of that same colonial violence, not benign at all.
Now, some people might argue, well, the idea of animal guides feels universal, so shouldn't it be open to everyone? How does that argument hold up against these critiques?
That defense often misses the crucial context of power. The issue isn't really whether the spiritual impulse to connect with nature is exclusive to one group. It probably isn't. The issue is that the specific terms, the specific rituals, the specific cultural forms developed by a marginalized and oppressed group are being taken, redefined, and often sold by the dominant culture, usually without permission, without understanding, and without any form of reciprocity or giving back.
So it's not neutral cultural exchange.
Critics argue it's an extension of colonial logic. First, land and resources were taken. Then children were taken for forced assimilation in schools. Now, even spirituality itself is being extracted, repackaged, and sold, often in ways that completely contradict its original meaning and purpose.
Reenacting the power imbalance.
Exactly. It reinforces that colonial power dynamic, and ultimately, it can threaten the survival of authentic indigenous cultures and their rights.
Okay, we've journeyed through this deep history, and we've really grappled with the critical issues of cultural appropriation when these sacred ideas get decontextualized. But to really round out the picture, maybe we should also briefly touch on how these beliefs look through completely different lenses, like philosophical skepticism or modern science.
That's fair. A significant critique from a skeptical angle is that these kinds of spiritual beliefs, even when they seem respectful, haven't historically stopped humans from exploiting animals.
How so?
Well, in many Western traditions, especially Judeo-Christian ones, animality was often seen as the opposite of spiritual something base to be controlled or overcome. This worldview was often used to justify treating animals as lesser beings, just resources.
Okay.
And even in cultures that did deify certain animals, the day-to-day reality of how those animals were treated could sometimes be very different from that reverence.
Meaning?
Historical records show that even sacred animals were often still used for labor, for food, sometimes for ritual sacrifice. Spiritual status didn't always mean they were exempt from human needs or uses. The spiritual meaning was often for human benefit, not necessarily for the animal's own sake.
Which leads to a critique about anthropocentrism.
Right.
Human-centeredness.
Exactly. From a skeptical view, many spiritual beliefs about animals are ultimately human projections. We see in animals the qualities we value, or fear, or aspire to in ourselves.
The spirit animal becomes a mirror for us.
A symbolic mirror for the human self, yes. A tool for our own psychological journey or spiritual quest, rather than a genuine attempt to engage with another kind of being on its own terms. As one scholar put it, spirituality has been for us, not for the animers.
And how does modern science engage with these ideas? Or does it?
Well, it highlights a fundamental clash of worldviews and methods. Science generally approaches the world through detached, objective observation, looking for material causes and explanations.
Right, the scientific method.
Animism, as we discussed, engages the world through respectful, subjective relationship, trying to communicate with other than human persons. So if someone gets sick after visiting a sacred mountain, a scientist might look for disease vectors, bacteria, viruses.
Makes sense.
But a local shaman might attribute the illness to spirits angered by disrespect shown at the sacred site. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive facts, but they are radically different ways of explaining and relating to the event.
Different frameworks entirely.
Completely. Though, interestingly, some scholars are now arguing that science itself might actually have something to learn from animist traditions, particularly about how to approach communication with non-human beings respectfully.
That's an interesting twist. So this critical analysis really brings out a deep paradox, doesn't it? At the heart of this modern fascination with spirit animals.
It really does.
For many people, the desire to connect with an animal guide seems genuine. It comes from wanting a more meaningful, respectful relationship with nature, maybe reacting against feeling alienated from it in modern life.
Understandable yearning.
So what does this all mean?
Well, the paradox is that the very way many people try to pursue that connection, by taking an often misunderstanding indigenous concepts without context, is seen as profoundly disrespectful by the very cultures they might admire for having that connection. Intent versus impact.
Right. The intention might be respectful, but the impact, when filtered through historical ignorance and those colonial power dynamics we talked about, often ends up causing harm.
And this paradox really suggests that finding a truly respectful path towards connection means we can't just bypass the hard work. The work of decolonization, of education, of actually listening to the voices of the living people whose sacred traditions are involved here.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels like the crucial question is, how can someone engage respectfully with this whole area, moving beyond just a superficial attraction?
Towards something more intellectually honest, more ethically responsible.
Exactly. How do we do that? What are those pathways for respectful engagement based on everything we've discussed?
Okay, based on the insights from our sources, there seem to be a few key pathways. First, and maybe most importantly, education must come before adoption.
No, before you go.
Pretty much. Instead of just consuming generic, blended spirit animal stuff, a respectful approach means really learning about the specific cultural origins, the specific context of these beliefs.
Like knowing the difference between...
Knowing the difference between, say, an Iroquois clan animal, which is about inherited kinship, and a Hindu Vahana, which is a deity's mount, or a Celtic shapeshifter, which speaks to fluidity,
Right.
or a Jungian archetype, which is about internal psychology.
They're not interchangeable.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Recognizing their distinct concepts, like different dialects of a rich language, not just synonyms for the same vague idea.
Okay, understand the specific flavors, not just generic animal spirit ice cream. Got it.
Exactly. Second, that education needs to lead to respect for cultural boundaries, meaning acknowledging that some knowledge, some practices within indigenous and other traditions are considered sacred, maybe secret, and simply are intended for outsiders. That's a crucial act of respect.
So recognizing not everything is for public consumption.
Right. And understanding that using specific cultural terms, specific concepts without permission, without context, can be genuinely hurtful and harmful, no matter how good your intentions might feel to you.
That feels like a clear, actionable boundary to be mindful of.
Third, if someone feels drawn to the wisdom in these traditions, particularly indigenous ways of relating to nature, then genuine respect means supporting the sovereignty and well-being of the living peoples these traditions come from.
Moving beyond just admiration.
Yes. That respect should translate into tangible support for their ongoing struggles for land rights, for cultural revitalization efforts, for environmental justice, for self-determination. Action, not just appropriation.
That's a powerful and very concrete step.
And finally, perhaps a really powerful way to honor the core spirit of these traditions, the animist sense of kinship, is to refocus on your local ecology.
Look around you.
Exactly. As the Smithsonian suggested, instead of symbolically claiming some exotic animal from a culture far away, maybe cultivate a deep, observant, reciprocal relationship with the actual animals, the plants, the land, right there in your own environment, your own bioregion.
Get to know your own non-human neighbors.
Precisely. This shifts the focus from the abstract, potentially appropriative, toward the tangible, the relational, the here and now, building real kinship where you live.
Which leaves us with a really interesting thought to end on, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. How might truly embracing that kind of deep, respectful kinship with the nature right around you, where you actually are, transform your own understanding of spirit and connection, perhaps even more powerfully than any borrowed concepts ever could?